So we've almost come to the end of our first day, and we hope that you've been finding the sessions as insightful and thought-provoking as I have. And to close off our conference today, let me present Peter Flegel as Executive Director of the Government of Canada's Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat. Now, with his diverse team, Peter is driving whole of government systems change in the federal government from an anti-racism perspective. And this has entailed reaching and engaging close to 4 million people across Canada to inform policymaking and helping shape new federal policies and legislation and advancing new international agreements, such as the North American Partnership for Equity and Racial Justice. He's also working with federal departments and central agencies to implement an anti-racism framework for the entire federal public service. So let me turn it over to Peter, say a few words. So Peter, I invite you to turn on your camera and microphone, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan, for the introduction, and thank you to Dr. Wendy Kukier and the Diversity Institute for this really kind invitation to be part of this really important intervention. Really, congratulations for hosting this event, which is both timely and to be frank, a dialogue about saving lives from the scourge of prejudice, saving lives from the violence of hate, and saving lives from the lethality of hate-infused terror. Permettez-moi de vous dire que je me joins à vous depuis la terre traditionnelle non cédée des peuples algonquins, Anishinaabe, autrement connu sous le nom de notre capitale nationale, Ottawa. So let me tell you that I'm joining you from the unceded traditional land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, otherwise known as our nation's capital, Ottawa. And we are constantly reminded of the shameful history and legacy of the Indian residential schools and our duty of truth and reconciliation to constantly and consistently acknowledge the sacred land upon which we stand and the injustices First Nations, Inuit, and Métis across Turtle Island continue to face today. So for accessibility purposes, I am a brown-skinned black man with black glasses, a black blazer, and a white shirt. Comme beaucoup d'entre vous l'ont noté aujourd'hui, nous assistons à des efforts croissants pour instrumentaliser les multiples lignes de fracture dans notre société en utilisant la haine, la peur, la misinformation et la désinformation comme armes de division. So as many of you have noted today, we are witnessing increasing efforts to instrumentalize the multiple fault lines in our society by using hate, fear, misinformation, and disinformation as weapons of division. Historically, of course, hate and prejudice, as many of you have pointed out, and more specifically white supremacy, have been used as mechanisms to institutionalize privileges for some and multiple disadvantages to many others. Some would point out that the very foundation upon which the British North American project was founded was that, and that legacy persists to this day, from the confinement, slaughter, enslavement, and systemic cultural erasure and exclusion of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit across the country, through colonialism and its contemporary manifestations, to the forcible displacement, enslavement, and even segregation, yes, segregation in Canada, of people of African descent. Then the ban, of course, of, as many of you have noted today, virtually all Chinese immigrants for 24 years with the Chinese Immigration Act, commonly known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, that we're marking the 100th year since the discriminatory and racist policy was enacted, which the intergenerational impacts are still being felt to this day. We cannot forget, of course, Canada's legacy in containment by the Kamakata Maru saga, the refusal, and also the refusal to accept Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Europe, the Indian residential schools, and Japanese internment camps. So just name a few very unsettling chapters in our collective history. Present-day examples of divisions between and within equity populations have been discussed today. But this is not to say that we have not made great progress as a country to counter the fear in this divide and to move closer towards our lofty ideal of equity, human rights, and peace. We must acknowledge those freedom fighters, the anti-racism trailblazers, those sung and unsung heroes from all walks of life and backgrounds who paved the way so that the liberties and opportunities many of us take for granted today were enshrined in legal codes such as the Canadian Human Rights Act, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Multiculturalism Act, the anti-hate provisions in our criminal code, and more recently, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Many of the trailblazers, and many of them are with us today, have been around and made incredible contributions today. But amidst these triumphs, of course, we must bear witness that still to this day, of the historic and institutional racism, slavery, and segregation, the legacy of the segregation, which continues to persist and infecting the functioning of our society. We need only to look not too long ago to the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately affected particularly Black communities, which had the highest COVID infection and mortality rate, as well as Indigenous peoples and racialized and religious minority communities, to notice the exacerbation of pre-existing social and economic inequities. It is, of course, evident in the alarming numbers of violent attacks on Black Muslim women, as well as they walk down the street or wait for the bus, as well as the horrific acts of terror that stole the lives of Muslim family members in London, Ontario, as some of you mentioned, and worshippers in La Grande Mosquée in Quebec City. It is evident in the proliferation of online and offline misinformation and disinformation spreading Holocaust distortion and denial and harmful rhetoric against Jewish communities, Muslim communities, 2S LGBTQI plus communities, which is spiraling into violence and hatred into our streets as we speak. It is evident in the rise and recruitment, of course, of people who are immersed in white supremacist ideals, who seek to spread hate and dismantle our democratic institutions, the rule of law, human rights, and substantive justice upon which the bare minimum of the protection of our rights and freedoms depend. Many of experts have told us at the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat that there is an industry of hate bent on undermining the rule of law and our democracy. It's really a commitment to unraveling democratic societies, and it's a transnational in nature, tied to foreign state and non-state actors working strategically and well-financed with their counterparts around the world, including here in Canada. So now more than ever, we must come together as stakeholders have told us as a society to stem the growing tide of hate from taking over the nation. We must reject, as stakeholders are telling us, the ideologies that instruct us to distrust, hate, and even blame our neighbors for the ills of this world simply because they are racialized, Indigenous, 2S LGBTQI+, Jewish, Muslim, or disabled. And let me be clear, we're not simply confronting an isolated group of individuals. Rather, we find ourselves wrestling with all-encompassing ecosystem entrenched in oppressive and violent principles that favor some while they disenfranchise, impoverish, and dehumanize many others. We spoke about the dehumanizing impact of hate. So we are, addressing also the mainstreaming of anti-Semitic, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-queer, anti-trans rhetoric, and all other forms of hate with the intent of driving that wedge of division between us. So between communities, as I think Jack mentioned, but even within communities which are by nature heterogeneous and within which there are a variety of intersections. So across Canada and the US and elsewhere, the anti-LGBTQI plus narrative, as was discussed today, is finding its way onto onto agendas from reproductive rights, educational curriculum, as well as the so-called dangerous impact of people who are diverse on our communities. Stats Canada reported a dramatic increase of 64% a rise in hate crimes targeting 2S LGBTQI plus communities. So this is why for us at the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, it is impossible to consider the fight against systemic hate and discrimination in isolation from each other and in isolation from the struggle against all forms of racism, including anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-Arab, racism, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, homophobic, transphobic, anti-women, and all other forms of racism and hate. We are, and just again echoing Jack's point about the need for us to break down les solitudes, so break down and go above our differences and really come together. We at the Anti-Racism Secretariat are a multicultural, multiracial, and multi-faith branch within the Government of Canada, working to combat multiple forms of hate and racism. And since 2019, we've been committed and resolute in our commitment to combating all forms of hate. So to do so, we've been working tirelessly with thousands of people from coast to coast to coast to see that federal policies, programs, services, and legislations are designed in ways that center the needs and realities of communities and peoples that continue to bear the brunt of systemic racism and hate. So to do so, the Federal Secretariat has been active in leading town halls with community leaders, industry leaders, a national summit on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, roundtable discussions on a variety of issues with community stakeholders. And this has really enabled us to establish a community to government pipeline of policy recommendation, which enables us to play the role of a catalyst and perhaps disruptor or rabble rousers within the federal government. And so this catalyst role has included being invited to review and comment on multiple memoranda to cabinet touching a variety of different policy issues, offering our expertise and support to a variety of departments and agencies so that to be more effective in combating racism and hate by fashioning and implementing initiatives for populations with lived experience of hate and racism, developing that anti-racism framework for multiple business lines from procurement to grants and contributions and policymaking, as Juan mentioned. And also the international level, we've been quite active, notably leading the creation of the first drafts and the negotiations of the North American Partnership for Equity and Racial Justice, which saw our Prime Minister and President Biden and Mexican President López Obrador announcing their commitment to creating that partnership, which was signed in January of this year in Mexico City by our Foreign Minister Joly, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken, and then Foreign Minister Ebrard, I should say, of Mexico. This, of course, is laying a foundation for more expansive, a more responsive, and more holistic and comprehensive whole of government efforts of the Government of Canada to combat systemic racism and hate, as we are working right now, my team's working right now to prepare for the launch of a brand new federal anti-racism strategy in Canada's first ever action plan on combating hate, which many of you have been instrumental in helping us develop. We are persuaded, and that's why we are persuaded, that working in close collaboration with you will be essential to ensuring that the Government of Canada's capacity to drive results in combating all forms of hate in Canada are successful. We depend on your expertise, your networks, your acute understanding of the phenomenon, and of course, your commitment to working in this area. So we're committed to working with you as full partners in this endeavor once the launch happens. Because as stakeholders continue to remind us, we must come together to reject those who seek to fan the flames of divisions among peoples and communities who bear the brunt of racism, discrimination, and hate. We must be reminded that even in the most progressive societies like ours, many of us are susceptible to falling to the siren call of hatred and all forms of discrimination. Donc, nous ne pouvons pas permettre au fléau des extrémistes de suprématie blanche de s'infiltrer davantage dans notre société et de nous éloigner davantage de notre objectif. So, again, thank you again and congratulations for bringing together the group, and we look forward to working with you closely in this vital and crucial work. Merci.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you for underlining those wide-ranging initiatives and providing a great segue for tomorrow's discussion. So I also wish to thank you all, right, to our speakers for your excellent, thought-provoking talks, our session chairs for moderating our panels while also still keeping us on schedule, and of course, our many participants who joined us today. It wouldn't be a conference without all of you. So this now concludes day one of Diversity Institute's 2-day virtual conference on online hate, media misrepresentation, and systemic racism. So today we focused on defining the problem in many senses, as I said earlier, on painting the landscape. And tomorrow we'll be diving a bit deeper into exploring the solutions, including discussions on legislation, on regulation, as well as community-based initiatives and much more. So I hope we'll see you back here at 11 a.m. tomorrow. And thank you again. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Merci. Miigwech. Nyawagawa.